So, hi. Thanks so much for coming. This is really exciting to be able to chat with everyone. And also, I'm glad that you're all at a safe distance, so it doesn't have to be too terribly intimate if it's not necessary. Or we'll work that out later when we're further along. I want to first go ahead and thank our panelists for being here, and I'm going to do a little introduction. Immediately to my left, Deborah Bright, internationally exhibited photographer, editor of The Passionate Camera, and currently at chair of the Fine Arts Department at Pratt. Next to her, Virginia Solomon, postdoc in visual studies, art and design history and theory at Parsons, and Joshua Levy, who is writer, dramaturg, and curator of many projects, including Ephemera as Evidence, recently at Obama Galleria, and also some performance series and publications, in particular Petite More Recollections of Queer Public, which I think, so folks who in many ways have all kinds of affiliations and cross-connections to this work, to each other's work, to a sort of range of issues and questions that we'll be able to talk through. I was thinking that one of the ways to break open the conversation would be to use this book, The Lesbian Body. It's by Monique Wittig, and it was published originally in 1973, and the original is in French, and then the first English translation in 1975. And it's a kind of incredible, well, it's called a novel, which is, I guess, a term that one might use, that sort of pushes against every stereotype, I think, that might be received of how one would have imagined, 70s feminism or 70s lesbian feminism. Well, you'll see if you don't already know. It's. I was joking that I would be sweating, blushing, fainting, or clutching, but maybe only just a little bit, or you'll take on some of that role for me. And what is maybe a good origin to start with is that the translation was not so simple for several reasons, and one of them is that French is one of the languages that is quite structurally gendered, and so in the writing, Wittig originally wrote the je with a slash between the J and the E, where the E usually feminizes nouns, right? So as a way to kind of counter the inherent masculine dominance in the language. And what seemed kind of exciting in that, well, let me hear, this is what she says. Je obliterates the fact that elle or elle are submerged in il or il, i.e. that all the feminine persons are complementary to the masculine persons. The je, who writes, is alien to her own writing at every word because this je uses a language alien to her. This je experiences what is alien to her since this je cannot be un écrivain, so a writer is inherently male. Je is the symbol of lived rending experience, which is my, with the slash, writing of this cutting in two, which throughout literature is the exercise of a language which does not constitute me, slash, as subject. And so what is happening with the pronoun here in some ways really is an incredibly alive question currently, but it's also one, thinking about that slash also as a physical thing. There are two pieces in the show that are sashes arranged next to some sort of architecture, and those sashes are things that can be worn that kind of cross the body, but they also, in being made from latex, are also sort of referencing or constituting bodies. So maybe that can be the first sort of volley I can toss in your direction, either the slash pieces or that idea of how objects become gendered, or how objects, how bodies might be conjured through optics. So a little tangle.
Well, I'll just throw something out here. The relationship of scale to gender. and sort of the domestic scale of your pieces. They are pieces that would find their home in a domestic interior, say, as opposed to an industrial space or cavernous loft. And so I was very intrigued by, that there's a lot of intimacy. They draw me in to enjoy them on that scale. And yet, you're playing too. The other association I had was, and this just popped in my head today because somebody said, oh, they don't teach wood shop in schools anymore. And and that really struck me. Because back when I was, in junior high and whatever, the boys did wood shop and the girls did home ec, and I opted out and did art or orchestra, which was, where the crazy people, the arty people went, because, but there were these two gendered worlds. But shop, it just had this valence for me. And when I came in and saw your show, I thought about shop, because there's a certain kind of woodworking that you do that, again, is like things for the home that boys would make in their shop class, and so I was thinking of your scale models and things of that sort is the kind of thing that a nerdy wood shoppy boy would make, and yet the way that you've kind of mixed it up, I think, is brilliant. So I just want to say that my pleasures in the show have been kind of drawing on those associations.
And I think going off of this line of thinking about making, just looking at so many of the sculptural objects, and sort of the link between the representation, the objects, the fact that they're sort of appropriated things or references to things that exist in the real world, and the sort of formal, made, developed aspects of them. The way that the body is referenced in those two separate systems, right? The objects that directly, clothe the body, that suit the body in some kind of way. But then, the things that are, again, made, so made by the body. So it seems to me that the dual references of particularly more sculptural objects, right, of something that acts upon the body, but also as a made object comes from the body. That play, I think, is that gets kept, maintained in play, I think, is really interesting and resonates.
It's probably because I'm also preparing for my queer archive work with these students, but the conversation about the gendered pronouns and the gendered language in French reminds me of this beautiful little big book by Derrida that has the cinder, where he kind of meditates around this line that he wrote, where he said, the cinder, there is cinder, or something like that, where the la, I don't know French that well, so maybe you can all help me, but la with an accent versus la without an accent. So for him, the cinder becomes a she, but it also becomes a there, which is not present. So there's this kind of interesting way in which I think there's lots of cinder references in the work, lots of kind of burns or burn marks. I'm looking at those images from that series. But questions about how gender is constituted through these conversations about presence and absence, but also through conversations of the way in which presence and absence are intimately intertwined, right? So that it's not so easily set up as a dichotomy between boy, girl, male, female, here, there, black, not black, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I wonder, there's a section that kind of gets into that, that maybe I can move into and connect with. This is later on. I fall into a deep sleep. I fall into a well full of perfumes. My lids are before my eyes. I fall into somnolence where my memory fails. I do not know your shoulders, your white neck, your shadowed eyes. I do not know your palms, your exact cheeks. I do not know your belly. I do not know your breasts, your light brown nipples. I do not know your back, your wide shoulder blades, your well-developed buttocks. I do not know your brown armpits, your pubis, your quadrangular fleece. I do not know your vulva. I do not know your square teeth. I do not know your wrists. I do not know your sharp voice. I do not know your straight nose. I do not know your lips. I do not know your ears. I do not know your hair. I am destroyed for you. I sleep. I dream, or else I am awoken. I breathe. I produce suffering. I do not desire you. I am forgetful in everything and of everything that concerns you. I am not distressed. I am calm, peaceful, flaccid, quiet, incurious, neutral, full of composure. I'm an integral body blocked off from itself. I do not hear my blood circulate in my heartbeat. I do not experience the writhing of my viscera. I have not the smallest shiver in my hair, in my nape, in my back, or in my loins. No throbbing grips me in my clitoris. I'm perfectly at ease. I'm unchoked. I'm untouched at any point of my body. And at this point in my discourse, I laugh with fierce, insane, silent laughter, my most unknown one. I do not bare my teeth. And I think with that does nicely is does some of the constituting that I think also, Virgin, you were mentioning, but all entirely in the negative. And this piece of the Ever Your Friend series, which is in view there, and also in parts over there, and also many others in addition to that, I think connect. There's a lot of sort of historical references, but those are the ones where it hits most literally. So maybe that would be a good moment to dive in a little bit more to what the not knowing is, and if you, I could do some backstory of it, but I think maybe you also don't necessarily need it, or whether you're.
I think a little backstory on the work. I mean, especially these works would be good.
Because it's funny, as much as I recognize that they aren't, I can't not think about Robert Longo when I'm looking at them. Which is just no, I don't know why. I have no idea why, except that it's happening.
Well, the short version is that there's a book project that I did at the Lesbian History Archives that took part of their photo archives and images that can't be reproduced because when the archives started that they hadn't made provisions for reproduction rights. And so these were all reproductions of the hands and the bare arms, the fingers, and maybe what people were holding in the images, but they didn't do any more than that. And then this is a moment of taking, with a flame, with a laser, with, creating with these sort of burning and creation of cinders, the outlines of what those silhouettes were. And so they're even more kind of distanced, and so just getting that exterior edge or that border is what is preserved, and then what happens in the kind of clusters or groups of things is sort of all that is left to really kind of get a sense of what might have existed.
Well, I think, for me they relate to, work by a kind of earlier generation of lesbian feminists. I think of, people working in the 80s, and myself included to some extent, who were looking at archival photographs, whether they were film stills or snapshots in family albums, and kind of combing these collections for those signs of what was, invisible to the straight world. The way that an arm would clutch a little too tight, or the way that, fingers, so I see this, carrying on this, but in a different register entirely. It's much more, intellectualized. It isn't just kind of give me that photo and I'm gonna, draw a ring around that, those hands, but it's there. I mean, that, and I think without that kind of earlier desperation, that we all were combing through, these archives looking for those gestures that might speak of another kind of desire. Or, David Dieter's book, Dear Friends, which is kind of this survey of historical photographs of men together, holding hands and things of this sort, because so much of that material was destroyed. And of course, the Lesbian History Archives exists to send us that material, Don't throw it away. Don't let your family throw it away. We will, guard it in perpetuity, which, that is part of that intense desire to, say we are here, that institution, which is a wonderful place, and I'm glad you got to play there, why it exists.
Well, and I was just thinking about how you include the date. I'm assuming that it's the date of the source image in the titling. And if there's something about the sort of temporality or the temporal digging, so the overlap of your temporal digging with, I think, the temporality of the digging that you were describing in terms of looking through photos of the past, trying to find signs of a history that are almost figured through their lack, right? Through something that can't be represented, and how you engage with that by the fact of using cutouts. And I was just thinking as you were reading that Whitting passage that it doesn't seem to be so much about lack, but rather about alienation and about a relationship to the body and how she's figuring a relationship or a way of understanding the self that is not embodied, right? She's talking about not having all of these sort of relationships to her body. And so this negation, negativity, negative space, alienation, this kind of matrix that seems to be present in this series in particular. Was that the sort of space of resonance that you were thinking about with putting those two together, or the two being this work and the passage that you read?
Oh yeah, the connection there, I think, is a lot about trying to bring up the issue where even if, for example, I showed you the original photograph where it is two women together, how much more would you know from that than you know from just this burnt outline? How much can we really know except that, the existence of the particular moment? And so if that can be transmitted through this sort of cut form, in some ways there's a sense where we can't get away with the sense of knowing, and so that the persistence of the not knowing gets folded back into how the thing actually looks.
Yeah, well, so for the class that I'm teaching, so I'm teaching this queer art history class, and part of what the class is about is not giving a survey of of what queer art is, but rather having them think about where is a queer operation within an art practice. And what we spent a lot of time on today was thinking about how sort of queerness can happen formally, right? And so how these sort of the sort of experience of queer life and of queer social practices can translate into formal choices. And so, I think, again, going back to the way that, so the fact that it's a cutout, so it's an absence that renders the sign that is present in the photograph, and then the sort of play of figure and ground that then enacts because it is a cutout, seems to me to sort of be playing with that question, right, about how it's if the queerness or the operation of sexuality in the work is not just from its source material, but from actually the making process.
Yeah, I think that's really because what they bring up for me is somehow the romance of loss at the heart of queer history. That even if part of the history of queerness is that it doesn't have a history, that these are things that weren't saved until things like the Lesbian History Archive comes around, that also part of the way that we tell that narrative is one in which there is no history, so queerness has this kind of relationship to possibility, right? And that there's a certain romance about that sense of lost history as well, that like the absence of the actual hands, the making that removes the hands that were the part of the original source image, kind of, in a way, reenacts that, sort of, which I find really interesting, because I think it's a productive kind of romanticization, too. I'm not trying to, frown upon that. And I'm also just super interested in the way that cutting the hand out, it's, for me, and this is just maybe my interest, but it shifts the question from who is that hand holding to what can a hand hold? Like what is the possibility for the outline or the shape of this hand right here to hold something, some kind of knowledge? And it calls on us to then figure out how we could articulate that. Maybe we don't have the tools for it.
I think also hands, right? And sort of like if you think back to the Renaissance and the relationship between hands and artists, right? And so, like Leonardo's self-portraits of his hands, this kind of thing. So I think, so it's just bringing like the art making and like foregrounding the art making into that, into what Justin was talking about.
It's machine. We shouldn't ignore the fact that a laser cut it has nothing to do with the hand.
So that part of it is
I'm just pointing that out. I mean, not to be tough to obstruct things here. But I think that's one of the simultaneous beauties of this is just that it's kind of what Deborah was saying. It's one more step removed from that history of recognizing, grabbing onto that history, and outlining it. I mean, we're just 5 steps kind of removed from those images at this point, but yet you wanted to burn them in to the surface, not with your hand, but with an even more kind of violent instrument, which is the way a laser cutter works. It's completely driven by it's technologized. It's not the hand at all.
Because
if we're talking about making.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think in terms of that comment in relationship to Deborah, what you were saying earlier about the wood shop and what kind of spaces of making are gendered in what ways, and where we end up being able to find ourselves making. So photography is in some ways a really close cousin to this work, and photography is kind of gender neutral in some ways, or at least maybe a little bit less so than some other categories of making. But then you're also saying that this is in terms of a domestic scale would pull it out of that. So in what's
tension, a nice tension, I think.
But also what's curious in that is the most industrial tool that I work with is this laser cutter in this sooty room where, I can't tell you how many more sheets of this just have big paw prints on them, and they're just accidentally got cut in half with a piece of metal that was stacked up against the laser cutter. So that sense of remove or closeness or the relationship that we can have to the culture of the space that's being made. I think that's a tricky question.
There's a way in which also the technology of the laser cutter actually gets us closer to the archive, because the archive is a technology, right? If we have things like memory and the way we remember things, the archive exists to preserve things so that we don't have to do that, right? It gives us the tools to kind of bring memory to the surface without having any sort of embodied relationship to it necessarily. So there's a way in which if the technology of the laser cutter, like the technology of the archive, is about reproduction, right, in a certain way, about reproducing what you give the machine to produce for you, that there's a kind of thing about what does the machine remember and what is the exchange that's going on there versus more the kind of sense of the hand as a sort of unique gesture, which I think it could be said to be the kind of overarching kind of masculinist assumption that that's what art making is. It has some sort of relationship to kind of Leonardo's hand. I think it's important though.
Although, I think as if you think about scale, and sort of like the development of post-war art and the way in which certain kinds of art making, like as art making became more industrialized and like more fabricated and stuff like that, if that kind of hand making then moved, if you look at like the prevalence of craft within feminist art practices, and then how craft is making a resurgence in queer art practices and stuff like that, I wonder, and I think to like as an interesting tension, not as a contradiction in any way, but that how hand and making have moved like through various genderings, I think maybe makes it not quite so straightforward that like hand is still on Leonardo's hand, which I know is my example, so.
No, I think that's but it's really important. Like, I'm certainly not trying to set up that as the only association, but just one. Yeah. And I think that's the craft kind of stuff.
I have a hand quote. Should we do a witty interlude? This is where it starts to get a little bit more exciting and terrifying as a reader. I have. Yes, this one. Okay. The sheet that I have marking this says bottoming / receiving. And then after it says the relationship between the artist and the audience. Which I think I meant not to read out loud, actually. Okay. Here we go. You turn me inside out. I am a glove in your hands, gently, firmly, inexorably holding my throat in your palm. I struggle, I am frantic, I enjoy fear, you count the veins and the arteries, you retract them to one side, you reach the vital organs, you breathe into my lungs through my mouth, I stifle, you hold the long tubes of the viscera, you unfold them, you uncoil them, you slide them around your neck, slopping, you let them go, you cry out, you say delightful stink, you rave, you seek the green fluid of the bile, you plunge your fingers into the stomach, you cry out. You take the heart in your mouth, you lick it for a long time, your tongue playing with the coronary arteries. You take it in your hands. I cannot speak, your teeth biting my cheeks, your lips unscathed at the edge of my lips. You, your sovereign hair over my face, bent over, you look. You, your eyes not quitting my eyes, covered with liquids, acids, chewed, digested nourishment. You full of juices, corroded in an odor of dung and urine, crawl up to my carotid in order to sever it. Glory.
Okay, my riff is when I walked in and saw this show and took it in, I thought, it's so clean. It's clean. There's a kind of infirmary feel to the space. Everything is very in its place. No specks of dust, no rough edges. Everything's been groomed. And so, when you read Wittig and her, Baroque, ode or paean to the physicality and sloppiness and visceral, exposure of just, the lesbian body, the body of the lover. It's almost the antithesis of what I see here. But then, where it does leak out are in these found objects that you've incorporated, the boxing gloves and these old hockey pads, which are pretty much presented in their, real physical state. They haven't been highly mediated, other than the addition of the fur. And, and they're full of the stains and the leaks, that I feel in this text. So I'm kind of interested in that tension, that you would choose this in relation to this work, when in fact most of it is very restrained and very antiseptic in a way.
Although I wonder if the antisepticness of the work that more directly references S&M practices, like if that antiseptic, the antiseptic nature of work that refers to the very messy practices, like if that maybe even brings it out, like it almost feels messier because of the antiseptic presentation.
Yeah.
So yeah, like these.
Oh,
I feel like we should like be having a walking tour since we can go look at the things we're talking about as we're talking about them.
Yeah.
There was actually, this is the silly sort of aside that you get for coming here, but there actually was a walking tour that came through, and while they were here, my mom and her best friend and her sister were also here, and they were talking about what the artist does and what the artist thinks. And I'm not sure about this, and then the friend at some point said, well, you can ask your mom, she's right here. And the tour guide just utterly pale. And then she got to have her moment of like, the expert, I get to talk about things. And I think that was after he had said, you know, everything looks like a vagina, or, you know, witness here these perforations and these holes, witness here the various ways in which one might penetrate this piece, witness here the... So, yeah, so, but no, I think that's, I don't know if what you're saying sort of reveals something about my own need to like
speculating,
control or tidy or...
Well, I mean, we're left to read what we want into it. That's the joy of art.
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking on that, like, can you speak a bit to your relationship with materials and, you know, how, maybe not as general as talking about how all of this came about, but maybe choose a couple pieces and like what your, I don't know, connect. To me, there's a real sensitivity and there's a clear deliberateness to so much of this work, which I find refreshing. So yeah, just to hear you talk a bit about materials and your choices.
Well, I mean, maybe one thing has to do with what kind of labor is pleasurable, and so that it would make sense that one would travel from, you know, a more industrial production site or a wood shop to also just something that you can do on a bench, on a desk, you know, looking out the window. So that maybe accounts for some of it. I think also that expectation that one would receive certain things, like you all mentioned craft and how craft is being attached to feminist concerns and queer concerns in terms of the labor of the hand being evident, if not, you know, or the ways that also I think kind of allows for a certain kind of fetishized, obsessive, you know, sort of like many folded, ruffled piece, you know, with all kinds of layers. So I suppose that the process does really seriously inflect the work, but that it's chosen for its ability to do that. I don't know if that's quite as extensive as you thought, but maybe can I share that question?
I'm curious about the super clean jockstraps. Like, that was the first thought I had. Is like they're so clean. Like they look like they just came out of the package, kind of thing. Not that I'm a jockstrap connoisseur,
Are they
you know,
from
but they do look. They look
They
very,
look
very
Western.
Yeah. Like what? Because I have thoughts about that, but it made me very curious.
I mean, I think that the part that seemed most interesting to me was imagining what kind of narrative people could put together with two of them, and how you might imagine acting something out. And so the sort of pristine quality there maybe is a reflection of my sourcing, as opposed to, you know, where the very well-loved Taki lily pads versus the much less, you know, put to use jockstraps, for sure. But what was the thing?
Well, I think
in there?
I think part of if some of these objects are meant to have history, some of these objects are also meant to serve as props. I think that was part of the proposition, right? And that if the jock straps are something that you're thinking about, something that can be acted out with them, I think it's interesting to think about what's the difference between those sorts of things. I mean, for me, the super clean kind of marionette jock strap is something where there's so much like symbolism attached to that and to the jock strap, but without the particularity of a wearer or some kind of notion of use, how close does it get to, or how uncomfortable does it make me, for instance, to think of all those associations, right? And I noticed, like, in talking about performing with them, I mean, as soon as you say that, I go to historical references. I'm like, oh, well, you know, Andy Warhol had all those, like, silver jock straps, or the Denishan dancers had their silver jock straps and stuff like that, which I need to place it, but I wonder, it's interesting to me, that pull to place those in some place in history versus the ability to let them act as puppets. I don't know that I can say much more than that. But I think the tension of props versus objects is circulating in the space in different ways. It's really curious.
Yeah. Do I have one on that? I might have one on that. Yeah, let me do this one for a second. The tag on this says gerunds and gender. And I thought that might be a good way to get there. So the one thing about this book that's really sort of beautiful is that there's the long form narrative that's going through, and then there's also these sort of interstitial passages that take up a page. And so the difference is that they're all in all caps, and they are a series of groupings of kind of almost like a blazon, like a enumeration of different parts of a body. So there's like one that's a lot of muscles, and there's one page that's a lot of bones, and it's not incredibly tiny the way that it gets set up, but this one is the gerund page. The gait, the writhing, the running, the leaps, the bounds, the retreats, the gesticulation, the tremors, the convulsions, the throwing, the brawling, the tussle, the gripping, the hammerings, the blows, the embraces, the movements, the swimming, the shoulders, the neck, the cheeks, the armpits, the bend of the elbows, the arms, the wrists, the hands, the fists, the knuckles, the ankles, the knees, the clavicles, the eyes. So it's distinct from some of the other ones, which are sort of straight lists, in that there's a sense of movement and action that's defining the body in this cluster that's not present in the other clusters. And I think that ties to the question of what's a prop and what's an object, and what kind of, I mean, many of these pieces have a real sort of functional history or reference to them, but then also many of them, you know, at the same time are creating kind of narratives, or look like they might fit in narratives that are distinct from maybe what is on the surface there. So yeah, is that a thing we could get into a little bit more, the prop versus object? I mean, I think that's a...
Well, it leaves me a bit with a question, in particular for the found objects, about the sort of like specificity of the objects. So like if where they were found or how they were found or something like that, like if that is significant, or if it's the trace of use that is sort of like where the stuff is happening. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these are the sense of a beautiful thing that could never be made again, that is, you know, the leather version of what is now only synthetic, that's been patched over so many times, it's full of horsehair, that, you know, has all those kind of qualities to it that make it utterly unique and in a sort of like Velveteen Rabbit way, like real in a way that other things are not real, which maybe that's the real is part of what you're thinking you might wish to find in that piece, but the restraint to not do more with these, I think, has been difficult. I mean, I think this is a group of objects that I had for 6 or 7 years And I was like, oh, it's a sound piece. All I need to do is just make it a sound. Oh, I'll just do this other thing. Oh, well, what if I, and just, and so in that sense, the process was just like lots of restraint over a period of time. The boxing gloves, a lot of this, well, okay, so here's the archive connection, is that I would have sourced, 3 or 4 dozen pair of boxing gloves to get a collection of, like, what are they like, and what are the varieties of them, and that would have come in response to previous, 8 years ago project where I was sewing them myself. And so they were like all very matching and all very shiny, and so thinking like, well, what would be the other version of that? And so putting together this archive, this like, wall-sized cluster of multiple gloves that the shoestrings are falling over each other, and you've got, salesman sample of boxing gloves, so, ones that are basically 10% scale, being cradled by some larger ones, and that mix of something that's really cheap and something that looks really beloved and really carefully put together. And so in that sense, it's hard not to mention that and then look over and see the way that these stacked laser cuts are meant to also create sort of volume that references the technology of an archive. So the fact that those are those particular gloves is more that they're just a sort of excerpt that's come from that other larger collection. But that I could probably say that accumulating certain kinds of forms is definitely a way to think through or think about what kind of histories they might have or what kind of histories they might call to mind for folks. So before there was a latex sticky, there was a canvas sticky, and that was a found object, and the translation is to do it in this latex version to really pull out the skin quality and do this central core, not a little bit more aggressively than would have been possible otherwise.
I mean, there's a certain way in which some of these objects solicit or invite a performing body, or an interactive experience, which could be communicated through video or what have you, and yet they're installed in a way that they're, they kind of lose that connection with, was there a performative episode? Does the constructed object have a history that you made for it, as a prop in a performance, for example? Is there a video somewhere of some kind of weird private orgy that you staged, for your friends using some of these things, So that would give it a completely different kind of presence, I think, than just, kind of seeing it among other objects in a space where it's all about its to-be-looked-atness rather than its, physical being as, part of an event.
Yeah, I have a slightly less esoteric question, if that's allowed. Did you conceive of this as a whole, in the sense that it's all one piece with different pieces, or are they freestanding pieces on their own that are linked by a common theory behind it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is all work from the last 3 or 4 years, basically, and the starting sort of at the point just preceding a sabbatical from teaching, and then going forward from there with the charge to myself of shifting from a place of making where each object would be able to announce a thesis statement to you, to one where everything together has a little bit of just offers a fragment. And so when they come together in a room, something happens that might be different than what would happen if, you know, these are with a different piece or something is independently shown.
So that's your intent?
Well, the intent is to, I think the intent is, in terms of the rhetorical strategy, is to pull back a little bit and not give you, you know, the sort of beginning to end version of what you might think, and allow for a little bit more play between works. And I think that maybe also connects, Deborah, to what you're saying in terms of the imagined narrative, and you know, that they're objects and it's not a series of videos that we're seeing. And this is, I'm going to chip slowly 10% of your question at every, it's like some kind of half-life. So, okay, so this would be the show probably that has the least time-based sound or video installation that I've done in many years. And that part of that is a way to just be really delicate with the fragments, and part of the move of making works that I might think of or talk about in the same way I would talk about a prop is that there have been pieces where, you know, here I have cast this in plaster, Western saddle, and then made a video of sawing it in half, and then you see the video projected above the Native American diorama in the burned out Natural History Museum, and then next to that is the chunks of the saddle, you know. So there's a very much like okay, here's the object that's getting cut. Here's when I walk around the corner, I see the place where you filmed and staged the cutting, and so it becomes this super tight, hermetic sort of narrative. And what this show or what this body of work is trying in some ways to do is to think about how that might happen, how it might be possible to do something that's site-specific, sort of similar to that, but if the site is the White Cube Gallery, which is ostensibly totally neutral and has nothing to say and is absolutely antiseptic, although you've pointed out that antiseptic is its own real flavor too. So, yeah. Well, people like so gracefully transitioned to questions.
Yeah, some of those graceful questions. But I'm really interested now in the notion of etiquette, and as it relates to objects, props, and bodies. Because if I think of etiquette, I think of it as a code of behavior, you know, or different ways to interact, or a set of rules that imply that you will be interacting with others. You don't necessarily practice etiquette in private, and so, or maybe one does. But I'm curious about that choice of that umbrella term and the frame and the notion of the kit, because I think you spoke to the kit in terms of the fragments, you know, and all of them coming together as a useful whole. But really, it is that idea of what is its usefulness in terms of etiquette, and how are you figuring that out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well, in some ways, you know, I don't know if I can do much more than you've already done in that framing. It's really great. So I'm going to just borrow my second text for tonight. There's a catalog for the show, and Erica Wren, who's a really exciting scholar in visual studies, wrote the essay for it. And so this is her, I'm just going to steal her ending, the thrilling conclusion. So together the pieces speak to a unifying interest nicely articulated by the title Etiquette Kit, in presenting structures, contours, and a possibility for queer meaning-making and interaction. I've been scheming for a while now myself about a massive production of etiquette kits, motivated largely by social occasions derailed by common habits of rotely gendered politeness. Hello, ladies. As if gender identity were always obvious, or obvious gender presentation didn't matter, or misgendering might not disappoint, annoy, or devastate the object of one's friendliness. When I look at the objects and tactics on offer here, the evocative particularities of history, material, and texture, I see how much more broad, queer, and compelling such a project could be. So I think that, did I effectively outsource?
But I think, it gets also to Deborah's notion of the interactivity of the work too. For me, it does imply some kind of interaction that I'm not seeing or that is yet to become, or that you collect all your resources in anticipation of going out and being accepted too, because I think that's also a part of, now being a South Carolinian, I have a very strong notion of proper etiquette, and you want to be received in a certain way based on how you act and how you look and how you speak.
Right, there are certain things you don't bring up.
No. Many of which are in this room.
Many of us are here.
Well, that's so. One thing that I've been thinking about are the way in which each object sort of like sets up the possibility for a vignette of fantasy. So there's something about that absence, or about how the thing works as a prop, that gives you space to play out different scenes, depending, like, as if you were going to some sort of sex club and there was the shower room and the like weightlifting room and the like the pool hall or whatever. But when you're thinking about this in relation to the white cube, I wonder if there's a way in which having them together and having them be different brings the erotic charge of engaging with an object. So you're aware of at least the possibility of being in a space with someone else having like a different fantasy relationship to an object in the space. So having a different fantasy relationship because they just might think of something else, or because their proclivities might bring them like to a different place, to a different set of practices or whatever. And so and that was fitting into the way I was thinking in this work, that I think about in relation to a lot of work about how sex happens. No, I'm just kidding. But about how sex is operating, right? About how like the reference to sex as a practice can do more work than just be taboo or like some sort of reference to a set of practices. And it seems to me that just sort of like in that sort of matrix might be a place where that's happening. Maybe. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting to put a little pressure on the idea that the gallery is a neutral space. Like, there's etiquette in this space already, right? Like, there's a conditioned way in which we approach works of art that is somehow pulled upon by that very kind of call to engage with the objects, which I think is the kind of more erotic charge. I mean, that's what I was taking from that comment, that like it puts that tension on it, right? Like, we're not supposed to touch anything. Yet what is
or ourselves.
Or ourselves.
Right.
But like in some ways, like the latex, what does it do except like call to be touched in a certain way? I think that's an interesting way in which etiquette is already here in the gallery.
Or productively putting those two etiquettes at cross purposes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the being sort of like instructed to touch and not touch through what the material is and where you are, and that crossing is the.
Well, and I think in particular in the pieces where you get the two different modes, where you get the like clean grid wood shop with the moth or the latex, or
But it's etiquette as a mode of restraint. It's just right, and just based on just like you do not touch because we know that that's the proper thing to do. You do not say because we know that will alienate. You do not do because that will separate.
So everything first, and real negation.
So I said I wasn't going to ask a question, but as long as we're talking about the nose that seem to get us all excited, so that no, I'm not going to ask a question. So here I go. So you ask people about gerunds. So you add an ing and a verb becomes a noun. But I was wondering about the noun object, which also you just do a little play on accent, and it becomes a verb, right? To object. And I was wondering about the police barricade that's up there, and it's really easy to go all Foucault on it, as well as do all kinds of other things on it and with it, in the sense of an object that is about like forcible restraint and containment, but it's also were objecting and on the barricades. I was wondering about the queering and the sexing of these objects that seem to be doing various kinds of objecting, including to the certain kinds of sanitizing containments of the gallery. But to what extent some of the things that you've been saying about jock straps and about, I can't even name them, outside of my portcullis, the hockey pads, there we go, there's a sport there. So the hockey pads, but could this also extend to the police barricade? It's not quite the right size and also wider than it should be.
Well, and it also has a little green felt at the bottom, so that if it were to get nudged at all, it wouldn't scuff anything, because that would be really difficult to, one doesn't want to upset or, cause any sort of damage, of course.
Did you make it?
Yeah, and that piece is one of the balsa pieces, so it's sort of half split between balsa and pine and poplar, which is what the two main pieces are. So yeah, well, it's I guess I would say that it's absolutely the lightest possible version of no, or the most portable, or the most almost sort of it's the same kind of scale as around the corner the pink chair, that's the little kid's chair for like a baby doll high chair. So it has a little bit of toy in it too. But yeah, I mean, it's an object that has, I think, in some ways, a really hard time just saying no.
It's almost no with a question mark.
Well, there's a way it is asking, right? Because it's not, this barricade isn't actually going to keep you from going anywhere. It's like, no, because I look like what a barricade's supposed to look like, but I'm not actually a barricade that's going to serve any kind of purpose. Because, yeah, you could pick me up and move me without any problems.
So why on the wall as opposed to on the floor?
Yeah, I think that's the, if this weren't a white cube space, I think I might put it somewhere that would be a little bit more about blocking the physical path space. But at painting height in a white gallery cube, I think it does something that's a little bit more abrasive, in that the wall is supposed to be safe for flat things. And it doesn't do that. As much as it's really incredibly light and gentle, it still juts out at a pretty sharp
It's an
angle.
aggressive angle, yeah.
I feel like it emphasizes the felt, which seems really important to
So
it.
you get a little bit of a shot of
underneath.
Yeah, exactly.
It's protective too, though, right? Like the other side of the barricade is that it's protecting in a way. I mean, maybe that's just my impulse that I saw that and I want to sit underneath it. Like I like the small space that's underneath something like that. But I do think there's an interesting play going on there in terms of it, and it makes me think of the third part of the title for this evening, behavior preparedness. Because I was thinking about that on the way over here, and we are often more conditioned to hear disaster preparedness, right, as a phrase, but there's a kind of way in which the logic of preparation for something to come is about a refusal to allow a certain openness to futurity. It's operating in a certain anxious mode, and what is it to push the kind of obstructing thing aside that can both keep you out but also keep you safe, right? Can kind of create divisions or divert you from danger zones or falling down a manhole, anything like that.
Cool.
Well, then, yeah, I mean, that behavior preparedness, a sense of what kind of etiquette and what kind of behavior and how might we prepare for a different sort of behavior, or how might we construct a different kind of etiquette that would allow for a series of different sorts of interactions. I think that's maybe a good way to tie what you two are talking about. I think maybe, are there any more things folks want to ask from?
Here's a banal question. What's your favorite piece of music?
I don't know about that. That's a terrifying question.
No, I mean, I always find stuff like that interesting. When, you look at it, you go like, you know what? I like that. Because often, as artists, we're so hypercritical of our own work as we're doing it, and every now and then we can just step back and go, you know what? That doesn't suck. I actually like that. Of everything in here, what do you look in here and you go, you know what? I'm really proud of that.
Well, I mean, if it's about like Huzzah, it didn't, break. It only took 3 tries, or there are a few of those. But I think the fancy piece that's in the window has been an important one for me, in that it's an appropriation of a term that I have associated with all things anxiety related. So expectations around what one might be, or what one might do, or how one might behave, or be recognized, or be acknowledged in some way, and putting that under the column of fancy. So this was a thing that I think, were I to, just think about my own mental health rather than make objects, that would be the thing I would have been least necessary to do in a different world. Well, is there anything that you all had wanted to mention or chat about that we haven't dug into at all, or?
I like you having the last word.
Oh, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I have this prop here. The tag for this page says parting lines, and when you're making a mold and casting, a parting line is actually the first thing that you do. It's the line that you draw when you're deciding how everything will come apart. So we'll call it parting line, but it's something else too. So this is actually the very first sentence in the book. In this dark, adorned Gehenna, say your farewells, my beautiful one, my very strong one, my very indomitable one, my very learned one, my very ferocious one, my very gentle one, my best beloved, to what they, the women, call affection, tenderness, or gracious abandon. So thank you all so much. And